Well, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us. I'm Indra, I'm the Director of AI here at NHSX, and I'm joined by my colleague, Simon.
Hello, thank you, Indra. Welcome all.
So today we just wanted to give you, in this welcome bit, a really high level and very quick overview, because you're actually going to hear from all of the experts in the field a bit later on during the day on the different programs that we're doing. So I hope everybody can see my screen and hear me nice and clearly. And I'll just get cracking and go a brief overview of what we've been doing over the last year, and then hand over to Simon to give you a bit of a bigger picture of AI across the landscape, but also to talk a bit more about the data strategies. I'm sure everybody's quite keen to hear. So here we go. So our motto in the lab has always been that this is about accelerating the safe adoption. Quite often people talk about, well, what is AI? What's it going to do? We know that we've seen a lot of good technologies come out. And what we want to be focusing on now is how do we actually ensure that those technologies, as they're developed, they become safe, they're ethical, and we help the system deploy them into the front line. So here is an overview of the different programs that we've got in the AI Lab. All of these slides will be available, but also if people are keen to hear a bit more and read a bit more about each program as the day progresses, do take a look at our website. It's www.nhsx.nhs.uk/AI-lab. And you can read a lot more on the website there. So the key, as we set up the lab, what we discovered was actually there's a number of different areas. It's not just about the technology. It's also making sure that we get the rules right, that we ensure that the system understands how to deploy it, but also that when we've got sets of data, that what is it that we want to do with those? How can we help solve some of the problems internally within the organization, as well as on the front line? And so here you've got an overview of the 6 key programs that we have in the lab, and within each program are more programs, of which we'll hear a bit more about later. So the one that has received a little bit of attention over the past few weeks, we had an announcement a few weeks ago, some of you might have heard, but also we've got some wonderful colleagues coming to talk a bit later on this show on what happened, was the AI in Health and Care Award. And the idea with this program is to make sure we act as a system to ensure that the technology out there is both right for us in the health and care system, but also right for those on the front line. So it's split into 4 phases. Phases 1 to 3 are very much about the early stage and the development of technologies. And phase 4 is very much around those products and systems that have either got market authorization or that are already deployed in different areas. And how do we, the NHS, start scaling those up? So we were really delighted back in January with all the applications. We had over 500, and out of all of those, we've selected 42 to go through for this round. And we're looking to open the next round later in this year, and you'll hear a bit more about those technologies through the next session. The second thing I wanted to talk about that the AI Lab is doing, and again, I feel like I'm the kind of the show starter, and you'll hear all about the details a bit later on through my colleagues Dom and others speaking later. It's about AI and imaging. We know this is a a more advanced technology. The data that you get from images is obviously much more categorized. So what we did during COVID is we had a lot of companies who came to us and said, look, we can really help you. We can really help sort of either look at images or start detecting whether there's pathology in those images. And we set up something quite rapidly under this space called the National COVID Chest Image Database, which is about pooling together chest images to help us as a healthcare system better understand not only what the pathology is, but also how do we deploy and validate algorithms that are helping us in this space. So do stay tuned in to hear a lot more detail about the image database a bit later with Dom and co. And the other thing we've heard a lot about from a lot of our users, but also people who've come to us from industry to say, how do you actually validate the algorithm that you've got? How do you make sure that it's going to work? And how do you then deploy it into the host system, whatever that might be, wherever you are in the healthcare facility? So we're looking at, through using imaging as a test case, how do we actually build this pathway, so we call it the AI adoption journey, from not just collecting data and accessing data, but also understanding how do we then evaluate a model and put it into the real world frontline environment. So we're looking at doing a discovery. Some of you may have heard a bit about it. If you're interested, do get in touch with us and do apply to work on that with us. The third program that's very exciting, and we're keen to hear a bit more about as we progress. So this is still in its novel stage. It's something called a skunk works. People, so my background is medicine. I'm an emergency medic by background. I'd not heard of a skunk works before until I joined NHSX. And actually, over the past 6 months, we've seen some really amazing ideas come through from different colleagues across the system. The idea with the skunk works is, how can we as the lab help you as a program team or a project team actually use your data, build something up to an MVP level that may or may not go further, but actually that we can understand some of the problems internally. And we've looked at different ideas such as synthetic data sets. How do we model on different characteristics? And we've got a few more projects coming up. So again, this is something, do watch out. If you've got some good ideas on here, we'd always love to hear a bit more about what's going on in the system. The other key pillar in the lab as well is about regulation. What we heard loud and clear was, it's great that these technologies are being built, but we also need to make sure that we get the foundations and the rules of the game right. So we've partnered with all of our regulators here in England, and we've said, okay, how do we actually help you together to build some programs that can address certain issues? Now, some of the key areas I've highlighted here, but one of them is around making sure that the advice that we give you as innovators, but also as the system, is streamlined. Quite often you're going from organisation to organisation, and we understand that. We've heard loud and clear from the community that if it was a more streamlined service, we'd be able to access it more easily. So we're working with all of our partners in the regulation space to say, well, how do we streamline that service? How do we also improve what we're calling post-market surveillance? So once a product is into the system, how do we ensure that we monitor it and ensure that the safety is maintained throughout its product lifecycle, especially as we get into more novel AI techniques when the machine learning is within the live environment. So things we're exploring with our partners. And again, we've got a great session a bit later on with all of the regulators. So do stay tuned for that. And if you've got some more detailed questions, they're the experts to ask them to. And what we mustn't forget is the international space. So whilst we're very excited about it here in the UK, there's a lot of work going on internationally around what's happening in AI. Earlier this month, some of you may have been aware, but the Spirit and Consort guidelines were published. And this is a real groundbreaking step in publishing what we call guidelines for publication in clinical trials in AI. A really important step. We've worked in partnership with the teams developing these guidelines, and we're quite keen to continue that. So anything that we do produce through the lab and through the different programs of the lab is maintained to a high standard. The World Health Organization has also kicked off a program of work called AI for Good. That's been going on for a couple of years now. And the idea is to say, how do we benchmark some of the standards for publication, but also for building in AI? And we're also part of something called the Global Digital Health Partnership, which is a partnership of multiple countries across the globe to say, how do we create both standards and policy frameworks around certain areas? For example, interoperability and cybersecurity. And over the past year, we've been working with them to say, well, how do we create a white paper on AI policy? And so do watch out for this space. We'll put it on our community of practice as we go along of what we're trying to do in the global market. And then the most exciting thing I'd like to say today is just from a personal front, we've spent the last year working really, really hard to build all these programs, work with multiple partners. And at one point early on the year, we were really excited about launching what we wanted to be a physical space where people could come, you could talk to experts, you could talk to policymakers, and you could talk to people who are building their products. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, we've had to pivot that view of having an actual physical space to saying, well, where do we create a virtual space? And so what we've done, and you'll hear a little bit more about it, is launch something called an AI Virtual Hub. So we partnered with our colleagues in NHS England on a platform called NHS Futures. And the idea is here, we can have a virtual space where people can come, showcase what they're doing, be it if you're building a product, but also if you're within the health and care system and you're using a product or designing something there. You can discuss issues that you might feel that you need to raise, and also that you can go and meet experts and share any resources that you might be building. Because what we're very clear about is we have some ideas, we're working with as many people as we can, but we need to build a community. We need your help to get this right. And so we've started this AI Virtual Hub, and you'll hear more about that as we come through the program today. And now I'm going to hand over to Simon, who's going to talk a bit more about the wider context of what we're doing in AI and data. Simon.
Indra, thanks very much. And of course, all of this brilliant stuff that Indra's outlined isn't being done in isolation. And the NHS AI Lab fits into a much wider range of AI activity being delivered across government. And so here we've got an overview for you of some of the projects that are happening across government to ensure that we support the adoption of AI technologies and skills across the UK. And I'd just like to draw a few out for you. So we, across government, we've provided 2,500 AI and data science conversion courses and 1,000 scholarships for people from underrepresented backgrounds. The UK government is a founding member of the Global Partnership on AI, which Indra mentioned a few moments ago, which is set up to guide the responsible development and use of AI across the globe. The AI Council itself has been established, and of course the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. And government has also just provided further funding to the tune of 50 million for the 5 new centres of excellence in digital pathology and imaging. So lots of progress and lots of work still to do across government in the AI field. As the Secretary of State said, this is an agenda that is on the move. And obviously to move this forward and to deliver AI's potential, we need good quality, linkable and accessible data. So moving on to our data strategy, which Indra mentioned at the top of the segment, we want to ensure that the sector is able to harness data safely, securely, ethically, and effectively for the benefit of patients and the system as a whole, and building on the opportunities for change provided by the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we're developing a data strategy for health and social care, which is trying to do exactly that. And we hope to launch and publish that strategy in the autumn. And the strategy will focus on some key principles around empowering staff and system leaders to be confident to handle data through simplified information governance. So we learned throughout the pandemic that cutting through a lot of the red tape, cutting through a lot of the bureaucracy and giving clear guidance to frontline clinicians about how they should handle data and how they were empowered to handle data had quite a sizable impact. Public trust as well is key, as is transparency. And it's probably the case that we have some ground to make up in terms of how we use data, but we are committed to, through our strategy, to show how we will continue to maintain public trust through our work. Sharing data to join up care across the sector, so promoting broader integration of health and social care is a key priority, whilst understanding obviously the differing levels of maturity that we have across the system. And also using data to plan and commission health and care services effectively. That will be absolutely key, as well as making sure that we provide, through the strategy, timely access to high quality data for research as well. And then adopting safe and effective and ethical data-driven technologies such as AI to improve health outcomes where appropriate. So it's an exciting agenda for data. And as you might expect, a lot of the resources to deliver this and the expertise doesn't always reside in the NHS. And therefore, we need to really ensure that we have the right partnerships in place. And as you can see from the AI award winners, we'll hear from later, partnerships will continue to be fundamental. And crucial to those partnerships is the support and trust of the staff on the front line, for whom we develop these technologies. We're also acutely aware, I think, of the value, the inherent value of NHS and patient data to the NHS itself. And if data-driven technologies can improve health and care services for everyone, then we have a duty to ensure that this opportunity is not missed, and it's done so mindfully and carefully in the right way, and that we bring staff and the public along with us. And the new Centre for Expertise, which was trailed a few months ago, is just establishing itself and is due to be launched in a soft way shortly, but that will play a key role in all of this. Sited within NHSX, it will support the NHS and care organisations to navigate partnerships in a way that will result in fair benefits on both sides, and will allow the NHS to extract the value of those partnerships, which will benefit patients and the system in the long term. So an exciting agenda. Thank you, Indra, for giving me an opportunity to share just some of that. And I'll hand back to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Simon. And as with all things, we can't do AI without good data. So a great partnership. We've had a few questions coming in through the chat. Some on the ecosystem and how we anticipate changes over the next few years with Brexit. I might hand over, Simon, just to ask you that question in terms of some of the legislative changes, if there are any, to highlight.
Well, unfortunately, I can't see the chat, Indra, so you might have to be my translator. But on legislation, yes. I mean, I think that the data strategy, I think it consists of two main lenses that we're looking at it through. So what are the cultural things that we can try to tackle? And then what are the structural things that we need to tackle? And some of those structural things will require perhaps some legislation. So whether that is doing some housekeeping so that some of the overlapping rules and regulations are tidied up, or whether it's looking at things like definitions of direct care. But those are all being worked through at pace at the moment. But we really need to seize on the opportunity that we have coming out of this part of the COVID pandemic, to think about how we can bottle what we've learned and fundamentally try to create as permissive an environment for data sharing that we've seen that we've been able to do during COVID. If it works during COVID, then it should work outside of COVID.
Great, thank you. And just in the wider ecosystem, we do have some of the regulators talking a bit later So as we do progress over the next few years in this space, we're very clear that we need to be, as I've mentioned, we need to provide clarity on that ecosystem, both for the development, but also the deployment of technologies. And so we are working to publish clearer guidance in this space. I'm just looking through the chat here. Again, if you've got any questions, do fire them through. A few questions around ultrasound scans. So just in terms of accessing data, quite often people ask us this question. For those colleagues who aren't aware, we have an organisation called HDR UK, Health Data Research UK, and they are developing a data research portal. So for those who are looking to access data, understanding which data sets are available, where they're available, and the different pathways to obtaining the data, do take a look at HDR UK's portal. It's really good, it's very informative, and it does give you a good idea of what's actually available to use. So we've got another question coming here. I think the easiest thing for me to do is probably just to read them out, and then between Simon and I we'll try and answer them. Is, do we have any insights on how you balance the need for patient safety versus innovation and opportunities, especially during the pandemic? Is another question that we've got. I think we've seen one of the key instigators, and I know Dom and colleagues are going to talk a little bit more about this, so I don't want to talk too much right now, but one of the key things we saw during the pandemic was the overwhelming response, the positive response of people saying, look, we have great technologies, do come and use them, how can we help deploy them? And so in NHSX, we set up a triage and we tried to kind of filter through all of those and send them out to the right teams, both across government, if they weren't specifically health related, but also to different services in the front line. And one of the key things people said, well, how do we actually screen these technologies? How do we know that they're going to be safe? How do we know they'll work? And so we published something called, at the time, it was a checklist, a 10-point checklist for a buyer's guide. But now we've published a whole document, which has quite a lot of information behind it on how do you know whether that technology is balancing not just safety, but also the different other criteria, the regulatory requirements, and does it have the right technical infrastructure? Do you have the right technical infrastructure for that product to be deployed into? So earlier this month, we published something called an AI buyer's guide. And later this month, do look out for it. We're also going to publish a kind of a joint guide called the Guide to Good, which highlights 12 areas that you really should be considering when you're building a product. It's an update to our code of conduct, which we published a few years ago. We were committed to updating it regularly. And we've heard from a lot of innovators that actually it's very good, but if it could be quite clearer on some of the issues that aren't always so clear, like clinical safety, that would be more helpful. So do take a look on that'll be published on the gov.uk site. Another question we have here is any more details on the funding for the cancer research centres? Yes, again, versus me kind of wobbling on about these, I would say do take a look at the website. We've got lots of information on there, and how to access some of that funding is there. So Simon, we've got one about data strategies here. If I read it.
Yeah, are the new data strategies intended to replace Caldecott as far as patient data is concerned? Well, the Caldecott principles are really, really important, and they have served us and continue to serve us well as a sort of guide about how we should treat patient data. So I would say that the data strategy will only help to complement those principles. But I think that what we have to be really clear on is that where behavioral change is needed, we can do that through creating incentives and give further guidance. But where we find sort of structural blockers, we need to perhaps act, and that's where we may need to consider legislation. So I don't see that the data strategy would replace the Caldecott principles, but I think it would complement them.
Great. We've got another question, which is a broader question to say, what are we doing to get clinicians and trusts on board? So Matt and Dan will talk a little bit about this later in the work they're doing on the AI award. I think this is a much wider issue. It's not AI specific, but it can be sometimes much wider around digital transformation. We've been doing a lot of work at NHSX around giving ensuring the guidance is much clearer. So during COVID, and Simon, you might want to allude a little bit about this, is some of the work we did around information governance to say, well, how do we make sure that the sharing of information is clearer, so that you as a leader don't feel nervous about sharing that information. And so sometimes it is about the guidance and making sure that the policy and the guides are very clear. And we've got some great resources on the website. And the other thing, as we've mentioned previously, is we are part of a much bigger picture. The AI Lab is one part of a big jigsaw. We're doing a lot of work across the system with the Digital Academy, which is there about training a cohort of a number of specialties to be leaders in digital transformation and leaders at board level. We've also appointed a number of positions to try and encourage healthcare professionals across the space. And we're not just talking about doctors here, but CNIOs and other healthcare professionals to be at board level as well. So we're part of a much bigger picture. Health Education England as well are doing a number of programs around creating fellowships and training programs, again, all to ensure that there is a wide spectrum of experts who can help drive some of this change forward.
I'd also add, Indra, that crucial as well to this is the voice of the patient. And so NHSX has brought patient representatives into our sort of structure so that they can contribute to the overall sort of strategic direction of what NHSX is doing. But also at each individual program level, there are structures to ensure that we not only get clinical voices and healthcare professional voices, but also those of the patient as well.
Great. So Alexis, conscious of time, shall we carry on? I mean, we can carry on talking if you want, or we can hand back to you. Yes, 5 more minutes.
5 more minutes.
Says 5 more minutes. Oh, right. Well, look, love chatting. What feels like sometimes, Simon, to you on a screen, but this is great. We'll carry on chatting. Yeah. So on. I mean, this is a broader issue of the critical functions of IT and hospitals being supported. So from an AI specific perspective, we are working very closely, and some of the awardees who have been awarded during this round 1 of the competition will talk a bit more about what they're doing very specifically with their technology to get trusts and systems on board. But from a wider NHS perspective, I know Matthew will touch a bit about this later in the day, but there's a huge amount of work going on the digital transformation agenda. Simon, I don't know if you want to allude a little bit more about the wider joining up care work, for example.
Well, I think yes, and I would also add, just on the wider tech perspective, that obviously we're doing quite a lot of work with the Department of Health and Social Care around how we can make sure that new build hospitals and refurbished hospitals are more tech enabled, so that that's built in right from the start.
We've got another question here around explainability. Always a great one. Yes, this is something that we do care about, and the outputs. And without stealing more thunder, I feel like I'm just the warm-up act, and there are a lot of great acts coming after me who are going to talk a lot more about the detail around this. But it's not just the explainability of a model, which is important, but also has your product or your model been built in an ethical way? Have you used a proportionate data set? Are you ensuring that you're not excluding any communities? This is something that we, both in the NHS AI Lab, but also across NHSX, feel very passionately about inclusion and diversity. And so we've got a chat a bit later with Brumi, who's going to be talking with some of our other colleagues in think tanks about how do we widen this research agenda to make sure that that we're including the relevant data sets, and also the training of those models are built on a wider data set. And then we did do a report last year with future advocacy around explainability. It is there on our website, and it will be there on our resources link if anybody's quite keen to read about it. It's a quite technical report, but it kind of goes through what are the key areas and points that are important when we're talking about explainability. And we've included it in our updated Guide to Good as well. So, conscious of time, I've got lots of messages firing away in the group chat. I am just going to see if I can grab the next few colleagues. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I'm really conscious that sometimes there can be a bit of fatigue of doing these webinars and Zoom calls, etc. But it's great. And we're really conscious that here we want to make this a real international community as well. But we want to learn from you, the experts, as well as those in the field who are doing this. So do take a look at our community of practice as it launches. And now I've got the wonderful Dan and Matt who have joined me here in a little box room, basically. So due to social distancing, I shall promptly leave and I shall hand it over to them. So thank you, everybody, so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.